Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about industrial capitalism and reforms that the progressives worked on to combat the worst of industrial capitalism. Before we get started today, you'll have to at least be able to talk about what does that term mean, industrial capitalism. You might see it on your test or your state test, and I want to make sure that you feel confident about that. And also, you should identify and explain at least two progressive reforms that did address that industrial capitalism. And so, what does this mean, right? So, if progressives are people who focus on political, social, economic, and environmental reform movements through government, we have to kind of start at why are they trying to reform? And industrial capitalism is the idea that major industries should be able to grow and do whatever they need to do to become successful. And we have the addition of laissez-faire economics on top of that, which means that the government should not really interfere or regulate what goes on in those companies. And so the less amount of rules, the more successful a company will be. However, that's not always the case. And what we see during the Industrial Revolution is the rise of monopolies. And so the progressives see these negative aspects of industrial capitalism like monopolies, brutal working conditions, really unfair wages and high prices, and products that weren't really a great quality. And so remember, these muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell kind of expose the really negative aspects of this system. And so the progressive presidents, all three, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, introduced legislation and reforms to combat these problems stemming from the rise of industry or industrial capitalism. And so they were known for being trust busters. And when you hear the word trust, you should just think monopoly. It's the same exact thing. And remember, a monopoly is a company that controls the entire industry of a specific product. So for instance, if I'm talking about shoes, if I am Nike and I buy up Adidas, New Balance, Skechers, Reebok, Puma, K-Swiss, Under Armour, I buy up all of these companies. That means that I am the only company selling shoes. And I can raise the price to be whatever amount that I want because I don't have any competition forcing me to use a lower price. In addition to that, the wages typically go down of workers who work for monopolies, and the economy becomes a lot more unstable. And so, anyway, these presidents are called trustbusters, so they try to get rid of monopolies, and they really start regulating businesses. So a lot of government regulation over the railroad or the telephone industry. They also work on conservation issues, so saving the land and protecting the land from the really negative aspects of industrial capitalism. And then lastly, these presidents were focused on consumer protection. So you and me are consumers. We walk into a store and we buy things, right? And so we need protection so that way we're not buying things that are unsafe or harmful to us. So that was kind of the main ideas of these three presidents going into their presidency. And so if we talk about Roosevelt specifically, we really see the expansion of the executive branch of government under Roosevelt because of his trust busting. And he uses this law called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890 that made monopolies illegal. And so with this Sherman Antitrust Act, the first thing that he did was he addressed the Northern Securities Company. This was a railroad monopoly in which our friend J.P. Morgan I hope you remember him from last unit, owned a stretch of railroad all the way from Chicago to the Pacific coast. And this was really bad for farmers specifically because they had to pay to have their crops shipped from point A to point B. So if I'm a farmer in Ohio and I need to sell my goods to someone in Pennsylvania, I would have to use the Northern Railroad. And so, anyway, Roosevelt uses the Sherman Antitrust Act against the Northern Securities Company, and he wins, and they are forced to break up. And then another trust bust situation that Roosevelt was a part of is something called the Hepburn Act. And the intention of the Hepburn Act was to give government the authority to set prices and rates for shipping things on the railroad. So the intention was that it would be more fair if the government was setting those rates as opposed to the railroad monopolies. However, even though it was attempting to break up the power of these railroad tycoons, it actually had the opposite of the intended effect. It actually raised prices, and the government oftentimes was working, this Interstate Commerce Commission was working with the railroad owners to assure that they were getting a cut of everything as well. Lastly, another part of Roosevelt's legacy is in 1909, the U.S. Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against Standard Oil Company. Remember, Rockefeller was the richest man of all time up until this point in history. And he was in charge of, remember, the Standard Oil Company. So by 1911, the Standard Oil Company had been in and out of court and investigated, and they were forced to break up into 34 smaller companies. So the monopoly was broken. And our current day relatives of Standard Oil are these companies right here. You may have seen their logos around. So Wilson was also a trust buster president, and his two main initiatives to bust the trusts were the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act. And the Clayton Antitrust Act expanded on the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it just made certain business practices illegal in addition to monopolies. So business practices that lead to monopolies were also made illegal. And as well as kind of getting rid of certain business practices, the Clayton Antitrust Act also exempted labor unions from being charged. And so this means that unions are free to picket, boycott, and strike legally. And then that brings us to the Federal Trade Commission Act. So this was created to protect consumers against unfair business practices as well. And it was a committee of 5 people appointed by the president. And it was their job to issue orders to specific companies that were being unfair or looking like monopolies. And so you can see here in this cartoon, the Federal Trade Commission here is like a hammer, and they're going to break up this huge roadblock of monopolies and trusts that's getting in the way of competition. And so Wilson was also focused on reforming kind of the way that money is made and regulated as well. And so the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. And this allowed the government to regulate the banking industry. So there were 12 government banks. And these banks kind of controlled the other banks in the United States. So the government had a hand in controlling all of the banks in the US. The government also had a hand in the amount of money in circulation, as well as setting interest rates. And it's really important that you know that the Federal Reserve Act is really a significant part of our history because this is the first time the government becomes directly involved in making sure that our economy is successful and positive. And so it's also important to know, like, why are low interest rates something that's good for the common everyday person? And low interest rates are good for these people because they are able to afford things such as loans to begin small businesses or loans for houses or land development. And so the Federal Reserve Act really does work to help kind of the everyday person. So this brings us to kind of the social aspect of these progressive reforms. And we've mentioned Upton Sinclair as a muckraker before, and he wrote The Jungle. And this was a narrative of what he was able to observe in the meatpacking and slaughterhouse industries in Chicago. And we've got an excerpt here. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat will be shoved into carts, and the man who did the shoveling will not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one. And so Upton Sinclair was really able to expose these awful conditions that our food was being created under. The factories were not running healthy procedures, and they were taking advantage of the no governmental regulation. And so the solution here is the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And so this is that consumer protection that we were talking about. And these are both passed on the same day in 1906. And it gave the U.S. government the ability to regulate the manufacture and sale of food and drug products. And so so this is kind of the turning point to where the government can become involved to make sure that companies are not selling products that could harm consumers. And so this leads us to the last kind of type of reforms that take place because of the really negative aspects of industry. So the really awful parts of industry on the environment is resource depletion. And so Teddy Roosevelt was really the first one to call attention to the really negative environmental effects of industry, such as our natural resources being used up like lumber, and our water becoming polluted, and our air becoming polluted. And so he first passes the Newlands Act in 1902. And you can see here, this is a brand new dam that was built. And the Newlands Act gave the people in western states that were very dry and kind of hard to farm in, it gave them federal money to irrigate their land and to develop their land. And so this was an outreach to those farmers in the early progressive movement that felt like they were being left behind because of this industrial economy. He also established the U.S. Forest Service in 1905, and this regulated lumbering on specific areas of land in the United States and protected the forests that we had. And so this really means that the amount of trees that could be cut down was limited by the government and enforced, so that we still had healthy parks and places for our wildlife. And so this does establish park and wildlife reserves. And then later in 1916, Woodrow Wilson is able to finalize the National Park Service. And again, this is just protection of certain areas of land so it doesn't become depleted and taken advantage of because of heavy industry. And you should get your prompts answered and turn your card to green. Thanks.